Morgan Blake. Entry Diary number 001. The Uninvited Visitor. What if I told you that a simple house renovation could unearth secrets so dark, so terrifying, that they could drive a person to madness? Would you believe me? Or would you dismiss it as just another ghost story? Stick with me until the end, and you might reconsider what you believe about the line between the living and the dead. Have you ever wondered what really happens when an old, forgotten room is opened for the first time in decades? The story I'm about to tell you is not just about peeling wallpaper or dusty furniture. No, it's about what lies beneath the surface, hidden from the naked eye, until it's too late. It all started when a young couple, the Mortons, inherited a quaint, old house in a small town. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever happens. Or at least, that's what they thought. The house had belonged to Emily Morton's great-uncle, a reclusive man named Victor, who passed away under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was heart failure, but there were whispers around town. People said Victor was never the same after his wife, Eleanor, disappeared without a trace one cold winter night. Some said he went mad with grief, others believed he was hiding something far more sinister. But Emily didn't care much for the rumors. She and her husband, Dan, were excited to move into the house, eager to start a new chapter in their lives. They thought it would be the perfect place to raise their newborn son, Charlie. The house was old, yes, but it had charm. The kind of charm that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. The Mortons quickly settled in, with plans to renovate and restore the house to its former glory. But there was one room they hadn't touched yet, Victor's study. It was on the third floor, at the end of a narrow, creaky hallway. The door was locked, and they hadn't been able to find the key. Dan wasn't too concerned. He figured they'd just hire a locksmith to open it when they got around to it. But Emily was curious. She wanted to know what was inside. After all, it was the only part of the house that still held Victor's secrets. What could be so important that he'd locked it away, even from himself? One day, while Dan was at work and Charlie was napping, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She tried every key in the house, but none of them fit. Frustrated, she decided to break the lock. With a hammer and chisel in hand, she chipped away at the old wood until the door finally gave way with a groan, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, the room was exactly as Victor had left it. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of age and neglect. But there was something else, a sense of unease that made Emily's skin crawl. The room was filled with books, papers, and strange objects that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a home. In the corner stood an old writing desk, its surface cluttered with yellowed documents and an odd, brass key. The key was unlike any she had seen before, ornate, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as she held it. Without thinking, Emily pocketed the key and began to rummage through the desk. That's when she found it, an old, leather-bound journal. It was Victor's diary. The entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about shadows, whispers, and a visitor who came every night. At first, Emily thought it was just the writings of a man driven mad by grief. But as she read on, the entries became darker, more desperate. Victor wrote about how the visitor would stand at the foot of his bed, staring at him with hollow eyes, its face obscured by darkness. He described how it would whisper to him in a voice that was not quite human, telling him things he didn't want to hear, things about Eleanor's disappearance, things that no one else could possibly know. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just a nightmare. But every night, the visitor returned, getting closer and closer until Victor could feel its icy breath on his skin. The last entry was the most disturbing. Victor wrote that he had finally found a way to keep the visitor out. He had locked it away, hidden it in a place where no one would find it. but there was a warning, a plea not to open the door, not to let it out. Emily's hands trembled as she read the final words, "Whatever you do, do not use the key." Just then, she heard a noise, an odd, rhythmic creaking sound coming from the hallway. Emily froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming closer, step by step. She quickly closed the journal and stuffed it back into the desk, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. But as she did, she realized she still had the key in her pocket. And that's when she noticed something strange. The house was silent. Too silent. Even Charlie, who usually cried out in his sleep, was quiet. Emily ran to his room, but when she opened the door, the crib was empty. Panic surged through her as she frantically searched the house, calling out Charlie's name. But there was no sign of him. Not in the bedroom, not in the living room, not even in the kitchen where she had last seen him. He had vanished. Desperate, Emily retraced her steps, trying to remember if she had seen anything, heard anything unusual. That's when she remembered the creaking sound. It had come from the third floor, from the direction of Victor's study. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs, the key clutched tightly in her hand. When she reached the study, the door was open. She knew she had closed it, she was sure of it. But now, it stood ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible beyond. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she pushed the door open, half expecting to see the visitor Victor had written about. But the room was empty. No shadows, no whispers, nothing. Just the same dusty, old room she had left moments before. But something was different. The writing desk, the one where she had found the key, was now bare. The journal was gone. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost imperceptible cry. It was Charlie. She spun around, her eyes darting across the room, trying to locate the sound. Then she saw it, a small, wooden box on the floor, partially hidden under the desk. It hadn't been there before. Her hands shaking, Emily knelt down and picked up the box. It was heavy, and the wood was cold to the touch. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the lid. Inside was Charlie, but not as she remembered him. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, his tiny body rigid and still. His skin was cold, and his mouth was slightly open as if he had been caught mid-cry. But what struck Emily the most was his expression, an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The sight of her lifeless child broke something inside her. She screamed, a sound so primal and raw that it echoed through the empty house. She tried to lift him, to cradle him in her arms, but his body was unnaturally heavy, as if he were made of stone. In her grief and horror, she didn't notice the figure standing in the doorway, the visitor Victor had written about. It was tall, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows that clung to it. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. It moved silently, its presence suffocating the air around it. As it approached, Emily could feel the cold seeping into her bones. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The visitor reached out a hand, long and bony, with fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far. It touched Charlie's forehead, and in an instant, his body crumbled into dust, slipping through Emily's fingers. No. Emily screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the visitor's laughter, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the walls. The visitor turned its attention to Emily, its eyes locking onto hers. She could feel its cold breath on her face as it leaned in close, whispering in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, "You should have left the door closed." And then, everything went black. When Dan returned home that evening, he found the house silent. Too silent. He called out for Emily, but there was no answer. Panic set in as he searched the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He found the third-floor door wide open, the lock broken. Inside the study, the air was thick with the smell of decay. In the center of the room, he found Emily lying on the floor, her body cold and lifeless, her face twisted in an expression of pure terror. Dent never found out what happened that day, but he wasn't the only one who lost something in that house. The Mortons moved away soon after, and the house was left to rot. But the townspeople know better than to go near it. They say the house is cursed, that it holds a darkness that cannot be escaped. And they warn anyone who will listen, never, ever open the door to that room. Because some things are better left locked away. If you're ever in a situation where you find an old, locked room, and the key is just within reach, ask yourself if you really want to know what's inside. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some secrets are meant to stay buried. But if you're like Emily, and curiosity gets the best of you, well, just be prepared for what might come through that door when you open it. Morgan Blake. End of entry.